Hello. Did you know that in biblical thinking, name equals authority, but name also equals fame? So, by obscuring the name of the Creator, Satan attempts to interfere with the Creator's authority, and Satan attempts to interfere with the Creator's fame. Let me show you. Jews have replaced the name of the Creator with Adonai, and even Hashem, while Christians have replaced the Creator's name with Lord. And how about Pan, Zoti, Her, Uram, Shoda Prabhu in other languages? Can you see the confusion? Do you see the interference? Therefore, in this video series, we will focus on the original Hebrew name of the Creator, Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. Numerous topics and arguments will be investigated and tested against authentic Hebrew manuscript evidence. Thanks to Justin, my son, who prepared these topics and who will also be presenting these topics. My name is Piet van Rensburg. Please visit us at HebrewGospels.com.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the series on Nehemiah Gordon and the pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. This is session number 3. Was Ketiv Kareh applied to Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh? Why is this an important question? You see the vowels on the name up on the screen in blue? If Ketiv Kareh was applied to the name, then those vowels are dummy vowels that do not belong with the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, but with the title Adonai, which the Jews read in place of Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. So this is a very important question to know. Are these the vowels of the name, or are these the vowels of Adonai? Now, before I explain to you what Ketiv Kareh is and what its origin is and how it works, we'll start with a video of Nehemiah Gordon, where he tells us that it is provably, definitively untrue that these are the vowels of Adonai.
Now, one of the things I was told, and everyone knows, it's a fact, it's common knowledge, which is that the vowels of the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh in the Bible are the vowels of Adonai, which means Lord. And I immediately saw, as I was reading these manuscripts, that was simply, it was a fact and it was common knowledge, but it was factually untrue. Like, provably, definitively just untrue.
Nehemiah Gordon says that it is provably, definitively untrue that these are the vowels of Adonai. Nehemiah Gordon also quotes Rabbi Bachrach, and this is from Nehemiah's article, Cutting Through the Confusion. This rabbi says regarding the name with the vowels Shua, Chol, and Kametz, that this is not a Kareh Ketiv at all, and there is not a single vowel here that comes from or remains from as a memorial to the title Adonai, or even hints at it. This rabbi is very serious. There is not even one vowel on the name that comes from Adonai. The question is this true? What does the evidence say? Is this true? Today we want to look at 3 main topics. What is Ketiv Kareh? What is Ketiv Kareh Perpetuum? And how does it work? And we will see that Ketiv Kareh originated from a tradition that some words were read or pronounced differently than the way they were written in the Hebrew Bible. Then we will look at the traditional pronunciation of the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, because those are the vowels that they would have written down for us, the traditional pronunciation. Then we will compare the vowels on Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh with the vowels of Adonai to see whether these vowels perhaps hint at each other, or whether Rabbi Bachrach is correct to say that there's not a single vowel here that hints at the word Adonai. So let's start with Ketiv Kareh. To understand what Ketiv Kareh is, you need to understand the difference between the consonants and the vowel pointings in the Hebrew Bible. So on the screen we have the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. the consonants are in black and the vowel pointings are in blue. The consonants are part of the original Hebrew Bible. So at the bottom we have a timeline, and the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, also called the Old Testament, was completed BCE. Though originally the Torah, for instance, was written in a different script, it's still the same language. So the block letters and the Paleo-Hebrew are just two different scripts of the same language, just like English flowing script and block script, or block letters. It's the same language. So the consonants Yod, He, Waw, He are original. They are a part of the original Hebrew Bible. The vowel points, however, were added in the Middle Ages. Some scribes, also called the Masoretes, added these vowel pointings into the Bible to record for us the traditional pronunciation of the Hebrew Bible. And these vowels are very valuable to us because we can see today exactly and precisely how the Bible was pronounced more than 1,500 years ago. However, those vowels only give the traditional pronunciation, not necessarily the original, because there's this thing called Ketiv Karei. So I will today be showing you the Ketiv in the color red and Kari in the color green, because by tradition there are some words in the Hebrew Bible that are not to be pronounced as they are written. You're supposed to read them differently. So Ketiv means written. It refers to the original consonants as they are written down in the Bible. The Kari or the Karei means read or pronounced, and that refers to the vowel tradition, the traditional vowels and the traditional pronunciation of the word. Now, before we look at a real-life example, here is a quote from an expert explaining how Ketiv Karei works. The Aramaic terms Ketiv written and Karei read are used in the medieval Tiberian Masoretic sources to refer respectively to the biblical consonantal text, the Ketiv, and the different reading tradition, the Karei, reflected by the vocalization signs. So what happened is there were certain words which the Jews by tradition pronounced differently than the way they were written. And so when the Jews recorded for us the traditional pronunciation, the vowels they put on the original consonants belong to a different word. Why would the Jews read some words differently than the way they were originally written? Why? Look at this quote from the Talmud. It says, "The sages taught all of the verses that are written," remember Ketiv means written, all the verses in the Torah that are written in a coarse manner are read in a refined manner. So Kari means read or pronounced, how you read it out loud. So when something is written in a coarse way, by tradition it is read in a refined way. When there's a harsh word, it's replaced with a euphemism. Now let's look at a real-life example of Ketiv Karei in the Aleppo Codex. This is the Aleppo Codex, Deuteronomy 28, verse 27. So let's read there. Yakakha Yod He Waw He Bishachin Mitzrayim. Yod He Waw He will smite you with boils of Egypt. And then the word in question, the Ketiv Karei word. Now that word is traditionally not pronounced because they considered it too harsh to pronounce out loud or to read out loud in synagogue. So that word should be, okay, if you want to read what's actually written in the text, it is written there, uva ophalim, which means and with hemorrhoids. Yod He Waw He will smite you with boils of Egypt and with hemorrhoids. So by tradition they did not want to read or pronounce this word hemorrhoids in synagogue, so they replaced it with a euphemism. So a similar meaning, a word that means something similar, but it was considered okay to pronounce it out loud. And that word is written down here for us in the margin. So this word has a circle above it. These circles are not always closed, but they tell you to look in the margin. And in the margin here, we are given the kari, or the karei, what was read by tradition. And the word that was read by tradition in the margin, as you can see, does not have any vowel points written on it. It has no vowel points written on it. The vowel points of that word in the margin are placed in the main text, because in fact all the vowels in the main text record the traditional pronunciation. Okay, so that word in the main text, the large characters are the consonants and the dots and the stripes are the vowels. And if you pronounce that word in the red with the vowels written on it, you are making up something that does not exist in Hebrew. So yes, we can pronounce it uva'efolim, but that's gibberish, that's not Hebrew. That's mixing up consonants and vowels that do not belong together. Those vowels in the main text belong with the reading tradition, which was a different word. So if we want to pronounce the original word that is written in the text, we should disregard the vowel points. We should find out what this word sounds like using other sources or using similar words in the Masoretic text. But when a word shows Ketiv Karei like this one, pronouncing it with the vowels written on it is false. It's not the original pronunciation. Now this is easy to see and easy to understand because they give you the Kari, what you're supposed to read in the margin. The problem with Ketiv Karei Perpetuum is that it is always or perpetually read or pronounced differently than the way it's written. And it also occurs so many times that the Masoretes did not want to write the same note into the margin hundreds or thousands of times. And so they don't give you that kari or reading tradition in the margin. So I'm going to take away that green box on the right hand side. Now, how do I know whether these vowels on the word in question are the genuine vowels that belong with the consonants, or whether they are dummy vowels that belong with a different word? How do I know? There are different tests that we can do. And one of the tests we can do with this word is looking at the preposition and the vowel underneath the preposition. So looking at the vowel underneath the bait preposition, I know that these are dummy vowels. So that's just one of the many tests that we will apply to the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh in a future study to see whether it has its original vowels written on it or dummy vowels. Now let's go on to another example of Ketiv Karei. And this is from the book Nehemiah, and they are building or repairing the wall. So let's read this. Acharai hechazik Hananiah ben Shelemiah. After me repaired Hananiah the son of Shelemiah. Now by context, that first word, after me, is a mistake. Because we are reading about this person repaired the wall, and then next to him or after him, that person repaired the wall. And after him, another person repaired the wall. And now all of a sudden it says, after me, so-and-so repaired the wall. So by context, this is a mistake. However, the Masoretes did not want to change even one letter of the consonants. They did not correct that mistake by adding in the missing consonant into the main text. However, they still recorded the traditional pronunciation for us using Ketiv Karei. So in the margin we have a kof, which stands for kari or karei, and it tells us to read this word as acharau or acharav, after him. And the vowels in the main text actually belong with the consonants in the margin, not with the consonants in the main text. And in the next verse, again, we have acharai written in the text, but we have acharav kari. They read after him instead of reading after me. Okay, this is easy to understand. They tell you in the margin to read it differently, and they give you dummy vowels in the main text. The problem with the Ketiv Karei Perpetuum, like I said, is that you won't have these green boxes in the margin. They don't give you the kri in the margin. So now, how do I know whether these vowels in the main text are the genuine vowels of the word they are written on or dummy vowels? Now, just by knowing how the Masoretic text works and the vowel pointing system, etc., I can look at this word acharai, and I can see that last vowel is a kamet, and I can look at the accent that goes along with it, and I know, just by looking at it, that these are dummy vowels that belong with a different word. So there are many ways to test these vowels, even if we don't have a note in the margin. Now let's look at a borderline case. So this is, in some manuscripts, this is considered Ketiv Krei Perpetuum, in others it's something in between. And the word here, what is written in the text, is lana'ar, for the young man. However, by context, it is clearly speaking of a young girl, not a young man. So, by tradition, they read this as young girl, lana'ara, for the young girl, or to the young girl. Now, in the Leningrad Codex, they actually write a kof in the margin some 13 times, telling us to read this differently. So they also give you the vowels of na'ara in the main text on the word lana'ar. They give you the dummy vowels, and they also tell you in the margin to read it differently. And the next line again, it's written hana'ar, the young man, but it is kri, it is read hana'ara, the young girl. And they tell us in the margin to read it differently. So this Ketiv Krei occurs some 21 times, and in the Leningrad Codex there are 13 notes telling us to read this differently. However, in most other manuscripts, they did not bother to write the same note over and over. For instance, the Damascus Crown or the Damascus Pentateuch. This is the exact same passage. So it's written, it's Ketiv with the consonants, lana'ar, to the young man, but it is read or pronounced by tradition as lana'ara, for the young girl. And they still give you the vowels of the kri. They still give you the dummy vowels, but they never tell you in the margin to read it differently. That's what Ketiv Krei Perpetuum is. It's always read or pronounced differently than the way it's written in this particular situation, and therefore they don't need to tell you in the margin to read it differently. Especially when it occurs more than 100 times, for instance, as we'll see just now. And the next verse, it's written hana'ar, but it's read as hana'ara. They give you the dummy vowels in the main text, but they don't tell you in the margin how to read it. That's Ketiv Krei Perpetuum. And this was a borderline case. In some manuscripts, they tell you how to read it, in others they don't. Now let's move on to a real Ketiv Krei Perpetuum. And this example is from the Aleppo Codex, but it is found in all good Masoretic manuscripts. So the phrase we have here is haaretz, and when you're just looking at the consonants, it's haaretz ahu, that land. Now in Hebrew, hu means he or that, masculine, and he means she or that, feminine. Okay, so what's written here is haaretz ahu, that land, but it uses a masculine that to refer back to a feminine land. At least in medieval Hebrew you can't do that, so they had to read it differently. They read this as haaretz hahi, meaning that land, using the feminine word for that, referring back to land, which is feminine in Hebrew. And this Ketiv Krei occurs more than 100 times, nearly 200 times in the Torah. So there underneath the word in question you can see a small dot. That dot is called a chirek. That is the dummy vowel point. That tells you that by tradition this word was read as he instead of who. However, because this word, this Ketiv Krei, occurs so many times, they did not write the kri, what you're supposed to read in the margin, nearly 200 times. It's Ketiv Krei Perpetuum. So I'm going to show you the kari. You're supposed to read this as the Hebrew word he, hey, yod, aleph. Although it's written in the main text hu, hey, waw, or hey, vav, aleph. Now, how do you know that that word in the red should not be pronounced as heave? Pronouncing the hey, then the chirek, then the vav. Heave or hiu. How do we know? There are linguistic tests that we can do, and I'll show you in a future study. We can see, just by looking at the Masoretic text, that this was pronounced as he and not as heave. In fact, there's no Hebrew word as heave. Although that's what's written in the text, there's no such Hebrew word, because that vowel is a dummy vowel that belongs with a different word which they read by tradition. So that is Ketiv Krei Perpetuum. They don't tell you in the margin to read it differently, and in this situation you always read it differently by tradition. The big question is the name Yod Heh Waw Heh Ketiv Krei Perpetuum? Those vowels on the name Yod Heh Waw Heh, are they dummy vowels that belong with the title Adonai, which you're supposed to read instead of the name Yod Heh Waw Heh? Or are they the genuine vowels of the name? Because if they're dummy vowels, and then we pronounce them together with the consonants as Yehovah, then that's just like pronouncing the Ketiv Krei hu, he as heave, and making up a Hebrew word that does not even exist. So you see, this is a very important question. So let's look at another Ketiv Krei Perpetuum, and we will see how that this Ketiv Krei only represents the traditional pronunciation of the word. In other words, the Masoretes did not come up with this new idea of pronouncing a word differently than the way it was written. They only recorded for us the traditional pronunciation, which was already being used by the Jews. So this verse says, Sevivot Yerushalayim, round about Jerusalem. And if you're just looking at the consonants in the red rectangle there, it should read Yerushalayim. However, by tradition this is read as Yerushalayim, with an extra yod between the lamed and the mem. Because by tradition they read this differently than the way it was written, they placed these dummy vowels on the word. You can see next to the arrow there, a chirek. That chirek has no consonant to go with. It's just squashed in there between the last two letters. Because you should pronounce this word as if there were an extra yod between the lamed and the mem. And next to it you can see the kamet, so oftentimes a patach. That's also a dummy vowel. It goes along with the pronunciation Yerushalayim. Because this word is always read as Yerushalayim, as if there were a yod, and it occurs hundreds of times in the Hebrew Bible without the yod, they did not write the same note in the margin hundreds of times. This is Ketiv Krei Perpetuum. They don't tell you in the margin to read it differently, because it's always read differently, and it occurs hundreds of times. Okay? Now, how far back can we trace this tradition of pronouncing Yerushalayim as Yerushalayim? This was the Aleppo Codex from the 10th century CE. Let's go back to the 2nd century BCE. Let's go back somewhere around 1100 years to the great Isaiah scroll. And we see how they pronounced the word Jerusalem. Now this scribe oftentimes inserted extra letters, sometimes consonants and sometimes vowel letters, that are not found in the Masoretic text, because he wrote very phonetically and he wrote what he pronounced. He wrote the way he pronounced it, oftentimes. So let's look at Isaiah chapter 10, verse 10, 11 and 12, and we look at the word Jerusalem. And there in the red it says Mirushalayim, from Jerusalem, and it has a yod between the last lamed and mem. And we go down to the next line, Lirushalayim, 2 or 4 Jerusalem, and there's a yod between the lamed and the mem. and Uvirushalayim, and in Jerusalem, and there's a yod between the lamed and the mem here 3 times in a row in this manuscript. So we can now see that hundreds of years before the Masoretes recorded the vowel tradition for us, it was already pronounced as Yerushalayim, and all the Masoretes did was they recorded the traditional pronunciation. So here is what happened. Whenever a word was kri, or read, or pronounced differently than the way it was written with the consonants, that's the ketiv, the Masoretes placed the dummy vowels of the traditionally read word on the actual written letters, as with Jerusalem. They placed the traditional vowels with the patach and the cherek, or the kametz and the cherek, in here on the word which by consonants should be read Yerushalayim. These are dummy vowels reflecting the traditional pronunciation of the word. And this is actually true with all Ketiv Kareis. The Masoretes did not make up the Ketiv Kareis, they recorded the Ketiv Kareis for us. All these Ketiv Kareis show us is how they already pronounced these words at the time of the Masoretes. They just record for us the traditional pronunciation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, remember, Ketiv Karei Perpetuum does not have this note in the margin telling you how to read the word. You need to know how to read this by tradition. Or you can look at other sources, like the Dead Sea Scrolls we just looked at. Okay. Now we want to look at the traditional pronunciation of the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. Because if by tradition the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh was pronounced and spoken and read, then the Masoretes would have recorded the vowels of the name for us to see in the Masoretic text. If, however, the name was replaced with a euphemism, with a different word which they read in place of the name by tradition, we are going to find the vowels of the traditionally pronounced word in the Masoretic text. So it is very important for us to find out how was the name pronounced traditionally. And we are going to go back centuries before the Masoretes added the vowels, up until the time just before they added the vowels to the Hebrew Bible, to see how they pronounced the name. Let's start with the Septuagint translation. This translation was made in the 3rd century BCE by some Hebrew scholars, and they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And this is their translation of Leviticus 24 verse 16. And the one naming the name of the Lord to death, let him be put to death. Let all the congregation stone him with stones, whether a foreigner or whether native born, in his naming, that means when he names the name of the Lord, let him come to an end. So by context, and according to the Hebrew, Lord here is Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. And this Greek translation of the Bible says, whoever names the name of Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh must be put to death. This shows us that in the 3rd century BCE, there were people who believed that we should not speak the name. And also everyone using this translation and taking it seriously would believe that we're not allowed to speak the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh or pronounce it. Today, everyone knows this is a mistranslation of the original Hebrew text. The Hebrew word here translated as name is nakav, and that could mean name, it could mean curse, blaspheme, etc. So, by context, it is a synonym of the Hebrew word kalal, which means to curse. So this should read, the one cursing the name of the Lord must be put to death. The point is that in the 3rd century BCE, there were people who, by their translation of the Bible, forbade people to use the name and to speak the name. And so they had to replace it with something else. They had to replace it with a different word. Let's look at the Qumran Community Rules. This is a translation of an actual Hebrew scroll discovered at Qumran from the 2nd century BCE, more or less that time. And it reads, Whoever enunciates the name which is honored above all. Now there's no question among the Jews and Jewish writings that the name honored above all is the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. So whoever pronounces the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, whether blaspheming or suddenly overtaken by misfortune, or for any reason, or reading a book, or blessing, will be excluded and shall not go back ever to the community council. Okay, so they're not allowed to pronounce the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. And yet they're copying the Bible and they're reading the Bible. How did they pronounce the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh? They had to replace it with another substitute or with a euphemism. So among the Dead Sea Scrolls we find different substitutes for the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. However, I want to show you that in the Great Isaiah Scroll, we can clearly see that the scribe who copied this manuscript pronounced the name as Adonai. So this is Isaiah chapter 3 verse 17, the Great Isaiah Scroll. And in the red we have Adonai with the waw or the vav in front of it. However, in the Masoretic text and in the majority of the manuscripts of Isaiah, it is written there waw or vav and then Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. So somehow this scribe was copying a manuscript and he read Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh and then he wrote down Adonai. How is that possible? Would the scribe say Yod and then write Aleph and then say Hey and then write Dalet? No, that's impossible. And scribes on average did not copy the Hebrew Bible by pronouncing one letter at a time, saying Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. They would pronounce a word or a phrase and then write that down. They would say Chazon Yeshayahu, the vision of Isaiah, and then write that down. Now what do you do when you get to the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh and you're not allowed to pronounce it because you'll be banned from the community? You have to replace it with something. So we can here see what this scribe replaced the name with. He read it as Adonai, and so he slipped up and also wrote Adonai into the manuscript. This mistake is only possible if the scribe was pronouncing Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh and Adonai the same way. Otherwise, this mistake is impossible. So someone came proofreading the manuscript, found the mistake and tried to correct it, but they corrected the wrong Adonai. So on the same line we have another Adonai, and according to the majority text it should read Adonai in the green, but they tried to correct the other one and wrote Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh above Adonai. So clearly the scribe made a mistake and he copied Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh as Adonai. In the next line, the opposite mistake happens. The main text reads Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, and then later someone corrected it to Adonai. So the scribe started with a manuscript that says Adonai, and then he wrote Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. How is that possible? Did he say Aleph and then write Yod, and Dalet and write Hey? No, he had to pronounce this. He pronounced Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh as Adonai. And so what happened is that more than 6,000 times for every copy of the Hebrew Bible, the scribes would say with their mouths, Adonai, while they were copying the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. And what happened here is the scribe said Adonai and he defaulted to Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. And that's a mistake that is only possible if they pronounced these two words the same way. So clearly this scribe pronounced Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh as Adonai. Not only that, here's another example from Isaiah 50 verse 5. Now, there's a bit of a problem if you pronounce Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh as Adonai, because we have this title in the Hebrew Bible, Adonai Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, and it's a title of respect. It means Master Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh or Lord Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. Now, if they pronounce this as Adonai, and then again pronounce Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh as Adonai, they'd be repeating the same word twice in a row. Now in Hebrew, when you repeat a word twice in a row, you are placing great emphasis on that word. For instance, the messenger of Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh called to Abraham, saying, Avraham, Avraham. That places great emphasis on Abraham. Or Yeshua Mashiach, who said, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. That places great emphasis on Jerusalem. So saying Adonai, Adonai would mean something totally different than saying Adonai Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. Therefore, by tradition, when Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh is written next to Adonai, they pronounce it as Elohim to avoid repeating this title twice. How far back does this tradition go? We can see this in action in the great Isaiah scroll. So here in Isaiah 50 verse 5, we have Adonai, that's correct according to the majority text. And then we have Elohim instead of Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. How is this mistake possible? Did the scribe say Yod and write Aleph and Hey and write Lamed and so on? No. He was pronouncing this as Elohim and slipped up and also wrote Elohim. So we can see this tradition comes a very long way. And in Isaiah 61 verse 11, the majority text has Adonai Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. And here we have Elohim written instead of Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. And that is how Jews pronounce Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh to this day when it's written next to Adonai. And here's another mistake. They also wrote Adonai as Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. So this shows us they pronounce Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh and Adonai the same way. So we've clearly seen that the scribe of the great Isaiah scroll pronounced the name as Adonai and next to Adonai as Elohim. And we will learn in future sessions that that's exactly what the Masoretes recorded for us, and that's still how Jews pronounce the name to this day. Now let's move on to traditional Jewish sources like the Mishnah and the Talmud and see whether the name was pronounced or replaced with a substitute or with a euphemism. This is a quote from the Mishnah. It says, "They went and stood on the steps of the sanctuary." So this is describing a temple ceremony. We're going all the way back to the Second Temple period while the temple was still standing. They went and stood on the steps of the sanctuary. In the temple, they pronounced the divine name as it is written, but in the country by its substitute. Okay? This is the Second Temple period. In the Second Temple period, before the temple was destroyed, it was pronounced in the temple as it's written, but in the country by its substitute. So this tells us that at least in the 1st century AD, there was already a substitute for the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, and they only pronounced it inside the temple. What was the substitute? Okay, let's move on to another quote from the Mishnah. It says, "And these do not have a share in the world to come." One who says that there is no resurrection according to the Torah, and Abba Shaul says, also one who pronounces the name as it is written, has no share in the world to come. Really? One who pronounces the name as it is written has no share in the world to come? Now, if the Jews accepted this as truth, then obviously they would not be pronouncing the name. Okay, so did the Jews accept this as part of their doctrine, as part of their halakha? Yes, they did. We can see this in the Talmud. So there's the story in the Talmud about Rabbi Chanina. Let's read this. The Romans brought Rabbi Chanina ben Teradion for judgment. He was sentenced to death by burning as he would pronounce the name with its letters. Now please take note, it says with its letters. So some people has looked at this passage and they infer on this passage that Rabbi Chanina pronounced the name with the vowels Shua, Cholam, Kametz as Yehovah. It doesn't say that, it says with its letters. And how could he do that? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah that these are the people who have no share in the world to come? One who says that the Torah is not from heaven, and Abba Shaul says also one who pronounces the name with its letters has no share in the world to come. So the gist of the story in the Talmud is, don't pronounce the name. Don't pronounce the name. They accepted this as part of their doctrine, as part of their way of living, their halakha, not to pronounce the name. Okay, then how did they pronounce the name? What did they replace it with? What is the substitute of the name according to the Talmud? Let's read this quote. Rabbi Avina raised a contradiction. It is written, this is my name. However, the Jews teach you're not allowed to speak the name, not allowed to pronounce the name, nor call upon the name. So what's the solution to this contradiction? Someone offered a supposed solution and said, the Holy One, blessed be He, said. Now please take note, whenever people have no authority for what they're doing or teaching, they claim authority. They need to somehow give themselves authority. So the Christians will sometimes say, the Lord told me, the Spirit told me, God told me, when they are going straight against what the Bible says. Now the Jews also did this. They either said Moses or they said the Holy One. So this person says, the Holy One, blessed be He, said, not as I am written am I pronounced. This is Ketiv Karei in action before the vowel pointing system. Ketiv means written and Kari means read. That's how they pronounced it. It is written Yodei Waw Hei, but it is read differently. How did they read it? I am written with Yod Hei, while I am pronounced with Aleph Dalet. In the Talmud, there is no question Yod Hei stands for the name Yodei Waw Hei, and Aleph Dalet stands for Adonai. The Talmud tells us, I am written Yodei Waw Hei, but I am read or pronounced as Adonai. So they already pronounced Yodei Waw Hei as Adonai. And this is not all. Here's another quote. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said, the world to come is not like this world. In this world, God's name, which is written with Yod Hei, is read with Aleph Dalet. Now first of all, you need to understand when the Jews say in this world, it means now at this present time. Okay? And the world to come is somewhere in the future when the Messiah comes, or in the resurrection. There are different terms, but that means one day in the future. But this world means now. So the Talmud tells us that now at this present time, in this world, God's name is written with Yod Hei. Ketiv means written, but it is read as Adonai. Kari means read or pronounced, read out loud. The Talmud tells us the name is written Yod Hei, but it is read as Adonai. However, in the world to come, it will all be one. God's name will be both read with Yod Hei and written with Yod Hei. So clearly the Talmud tells us that they pronounced Yodei Waw Hei as Adonai by tradition. Okay, why did they do that? Because all of the verses that are written in the Torah in a coarse manner are read in a refined manner. And interesting enough, when you look at this quote in the Talmud and you read the context, it names examples of things that the Masoretes later noted down as Ketiv Karei. The Masoretes simply recorded the traditional pronunciation. So by tradition it was considered blasphemous to pronounce the name Yodei Waw Hei. Therefore they replaced it with a euphemism. All of the verses that are written in a coarse manner are read in a refined manner. Okay, that's not all. Even the church father Origen says something about the name and how it is pronounced. Let's read this quote. There is a certain word of 4 letters. Remember tetragrammaton? Tetra means 4. There's a certain word of 4 letters, which is not pronounced by them, he's talking about the Jews, which also was written on the gold breastplate of the high priest. So there's no question what he's talking about. This word has 4 letters, it's not pronounced by the Jews and was written on the gold breastplate of the high priest. It's the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. Okay, there's no question about that. But it is read as Adonai, not as it is really written in the 4 letters. So that is the 2nd century CE, and the Greek church father Origen knew that the Jews read the name as Adonai, not as it is written with the 4 letters. This is Ketiv Karei in action before the vowel pointing system. Ketiv Karei means it's written one way, but it is read out loud a different way. This was already in action before the vowel pointing system in the 2nd century CE. To sum up, the Septuagint 3rd century BCE forbids the speaking of the name, and the people taking that seriously had to replace the name with something else. The Qumran community 2nd century BCE forbids the speaking or the pronunciation of the name, so they had to replace it. And we saw that the scribe of the great Isaiah scroll pronounced the name as Adonai. Origen, 2nd century CE, says that Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh is read as Adonai or pronounced as Adonai by the Jews. Rabbi Hanina in the 2nd century CE, the Talmud says he pronounced the name and he was put to death, and then the Talmud doesn't even feel sorry for him. They say, but how could he do that? We know we're not supposed to pronounce the name. So the gist of the story in the Talmud is, don't pronounce the name. We saw in the Mishnah that while the temple was still standing, the name had a substitute, and in the countries, the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, the divine name, was pronounced by its substitute. And the Talmud tells us that they pronounced Yod-Heh as Aleph Dalet. They pronounced the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh as Adonai. There's actually no question that before the Jews added the vowel pointings to the Hebrew Bible, they pronounced the name as Adonai. There's actually no question about it. It's easy to prove. And then the Masoretes came in plus minus the 6th century AD, and they recorded the traditional pronunciation of the Bible. The traditional pronunciation of Yod-Heh is Aleph Dalet. It's Adonai. We are going to compare the vowels on the name with the vowels on Adonai. Just keep in mind how Ketiv Karei works. Whenever a word was read or kari differently than the way it was written or ketiv, the Masoretes placed the dummy vowels of the traditionally read word on the actual written consonants or letters. Just like we saw with Yerushalayim, it was by tradition read as Yerushalayim, therefore they placed those dummy vowels on the word. Because this word occurs so many times, hundreds of times, they don't give us the kari in the margin. Remember, there's no kof in the margin. They don't tell you in the margin how to read it. It's Ketiv Karei perpetuum. The Ketiv Karei hu and he, the Hebrew word hu, read as the Hebrew word he, occurs less than 200 times, and they never give you the note in the margin saying read it differently. If Ketiv Karei was applied to the name, which occurs thousands and thousands and thousands of times in the Bible, and which is pronounced or read as Adonai more than 6,000 times, would they write in a kof 6,000 times and tell us to read it as Adonai? No, they did not even do it 200 times with who, he. They still give us the dummy vowels, even though they don't put the kari in the margin. Now here's a video of Nehemiah Gordon where he talks about mistakes in Hebrew manuscripts. And so this is an interesting mistake. The majority text reads Le'olam Adonai, forever Adonai. But this manuscript reads Le'olam Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. Now by context, this is a mistake. I don't mean by context. By comparing with other manuscripts, this is a mistake. And so someone afterwards came proofreading the manuscript, found this is a mistake, and tried to correct it. Now I showed you earlier how Ketiv Karei sometimes corrects a mistake in the Masoretic text. So this scribe or proofreader, instead of crossing out the name or writing eraser dots around it or drawing a stripe above it, he used a circle and a kof in the margin to correct the mistake, to tell you that he should have written Adonai. Okay, he's correcting a mistake, that's it. And Nehemiah explains this, he says he corrected a mistake. But then Nehemiah starts ridiculing the people who says that the name is Ketiv Krei Perpetuum. So listen to what Nehemiah says.
This is what it would look like if Adonai really was the Kri of the Ketiv Yehovah. It's not.
Really? This is what it would have looked like if it was Ketiv Krei? So Nehemiah is talking about the circle above the name Yodei Waw Hei and the kof in the margin. What Nehemiah is saying is, if they put the vowels of Adonai on the name Yodei Waw Hei, and they wanted you to read it as Adonai, they needed to put a circle above the word and write a kof in the margin and tell you in the margin to read it as Adonai. And they had to do this more than 6,000 times. They had to write the same note over thousands of times, telling you to read it differently for the name. But with the Ketiv Krei, who and he we talked about earlier, they did not even do it less than 200 times. So this is a false argument. For the name Yodei Waw Hei, which occurs thousands of times, they would never have written this note into the margin thousands of times. They just wouldn't have done that.
This is what it would look like if Adonai really was the Kri of the Ketiv Yehovah. It's not.
So Nehemiah is using a false argument to make this theory, the Ketiv Krei theory, look stupid. The Bible says, Lo tignovu, velo tekachashu, velo teshakaru, ish b'amito, ye shall not steal, neither shall ye deal falsely, nor lie one to another. This is a false argument being used to make this theory of Ketiv Krei Perpetuum look stupid, but it is false. Here is another video of Nehemiah Gordon where he says that it is factually untrue that these are the vowels of Adonai. Factually untrue.
And I was told this is common knowledge. Well, as I was doing my research at the Hebrew University, one of the things I found is that, in fact, God's name, as it's written by the scribes, isn't written with the vowels of Adonai, the Hebrew word for Lord. That's factually untrue. They say that as a fact, but it's factually untrue.
Why does Nehemiah say that it is factually untrue that these vowels on the name are the vowels of Adonai? Let's compare them. So the first vowel on Adonai is a composite schwa, 2 dots and a stripe next to it, a composite schwa. Whereas the first vowel on Yodei Waw Hei's name is a simple schwa, just 2 dots. Now that is the only real reason why Nehemiah says that it is factually untrue that these are the vowels of Adonai. So what I would like to show you is that it is grammatically correct to write a different vowel underneath an aleph than underneath a yod. Grammatically correct. Alright, let's look at some examples of Hebrew vowel changes. So what I'm going to show you now is very basic. And if you haven't learned this or don't know how this works, you might want to learn this, because it's very basic and you need to understand how this works. We start with the word gadol. Gadol means great or big. Okay? Now in Hebrew, the emphasis usually goes on the last syllable. So you don't say gadol, you say gadol. In Hebrew, you can also add all kinds of suffixes and prefixes to the words. So let's make this word longer and we add an extra syllable there and we make this gedolam. Now the accent has moved from the cholim, the o, to the am at the end, gedolam. So on the left hand side, underneath the gimel, the vowel in the blue oval is a kametz, a long ah. On the right hand side, that kametz is moved further back from the accented syllable. It is now the third position back from the accented vowel. Therefore it becomes shorter. And that kametz becomes a simple schwa. It becomes 2 dots, Gedolam. Okay? Another example, Yatom. Yatom means orphan. Yatom, the first vowel there in the blue is a kametz. Now we make the word longer, we make this orphans plural, yatomim. Now this original kametz has moved back. It is now the third position back from the accented vowel. Therefore it becomes shorter and becomes a simple shua, 2 dots. Take note, a simple shua underneath a yod. An original kametz rewritten as a short vowel underneath a yod becomes a simple shua. Alright, let's look at Adon. Adon also has a kametz as its first vowel, long A, Adon. However, the first consonant is not a yod, it's an aleph. And an aleph is a guttural. And when you have gutturals in your Hebrew words, everything is just a little bit more complicated. So, Adon is the most simple form of the word Adonai. So although Adonai was used as a title or as a name almost, Adonai means my lords, my lords. Alright, and it's formed from the word Adon. So you start with Adon and you add an extra syllable to the end of it, Nai, I, Adon, Adonai. Now that original kametz is the third position back from the accented vowel. So we're expecting it to become a simple shua. However, because it's written underneath an aleph, it becomes a composite shua. So take note, there's a difference in the vowel which is written underneath an aleph and a yod. There's a difference in the vowel pointing. Here's another example. Aton, a female donkey, and atonot, female donkeys. With aton, the first vowel is a kametz. With atonot, that original kametz is now the third position back from the accented syllable, the accented vowel. Therefore it becomes shorter. However, because it is written underneath an aleph, it becomes a composite shua, not a simple shua. And this, everything I showed you just now, is genuine Hebrew grammar. Not one of these examples are theoretical. Each of these exists in the good Masoretic manuscripts like the Aleppo Codex. Here are examples from the Aleppo Codex. A kametz becomes a simple shua. A kametz moved back underneath a yod becomes a simple shua. A kametz moved back third position from the accented syllable underneath an aleph becomes a composite shua. A kametz becomes a composite shua underneath an aleph, but a simple shua underneath a yod. This is how the Masoretes wrote down their vowels. Okay? Now let's just imagine that we are the Masoretes, and we are going to record the traditional pronunciation of the Hebrew Bible. Exactly, precisely the way we read it out loud at synagogue is what we are going to write down. Okay? Now we get to the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, and we know we read this word as Adonai. When we see the word Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, we read it as Adonai. So we now need to put the vowels of Adonai on the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. It's going to be Ketiv Krei Perpetuum. It occurs thousands and thousands of times. We always read it differently than the way it's written. The question is, are we going to put a composite shua underneath a yod or a simple shua? A composite shua or a simple shua? Now, if you can't remember what the answer is, you might ask the question, why does Adonai have a composite shua in the first place? We started with the word Adon, that had a kametz as its first vowel. We made that kametz shorter. We moved it back, third position back from the accented vowel. But because it's written underneath an aleph, we had to write down a composite shua. You can't put that vowel there underneath Adonai as a simple shua. However, if we rewrite that kametz as a short vowel underneath a yod, it should be a simple shua. If we rewrite the kametz as a composite shua underneath a yod, that is wrong. It's grammatically incorrect. What I'm showing you at the bottom is grammatically correct. In other words, it's grammatically 100% correct to put the vowels simple shua cholam kametz on the name for Adonai. These vowels we talked about in the previous session that are found in thousands of manuscripts and many thousands of printed Bibles across the world on the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh. Those vowels are exactly 100% grammatically correct for Adonai. They're exactly what we're expecting to find. The vowels of Adonai with that slight grammatical change is 100% correct. Like we just saw, a kametz becomes a simple shua underneath a yod, but a composite shua underneath an aleph. If you write this as Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh with composite shua underneath a yod, it is incorrect. With a simple shua, it is correct for the vowels of Adonai. It's grammatically correct. Isn't that what Nehemiah should be telling you? He should be telling you, look, we found in more than 2,000 manuscripts exactly, precisely the correct vowels for the Ketiv Karei Adonai. It's grammatically correct. No, Nehemiah doesn't tell us that. Nehemiah is in denial. Let's look at this video again.
Now, one of the things I was told, and everyone knows, it's a fact, it's common knowledge, which is that the vowels of the name Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh in the Bible are the vowels of Adonai, which means Lord. And I immediately saw, as I was reading these manuscripts, that was simply, it was a fact and it was common knowledge, but it was factually untrue. Like, provably, definitively just untrue.
Nehemiah says it is provably, definitively untrue that these are the vowels of Adonai. But he doesn't tell you that it is 100% grammatically correct for those vowels to be slightly different. Nehemiah Gordon quotes this Rabbi Bachrach, and this rabbi says, this is not a Karei Ketiv at all. And there's not a single vowel here that comes from or remains from as a memorial to the title Adonai or even hints at it. Is this true? Nehemiah quotes this rabbi to make us think that he is right. But is what this rabbi says true? Let's test this. So please look at these vowel points, the vowels on Adonai and the vowels on the name Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh, and think for yourself, is it true? Rabbi Bachrach says there's not a single vowel here that comes from or remains from the title Adonai or even hints at it. There's not a single vowel here that hints at Adonai. Okay, let's test this. Look at those last two vowels on the name and on Adonai. Do they look similar? Do they perhaps hint at each other? They're exactly the same. They're the same vowel, the same shape, the same name, the same pronunciation. You have a kametz at the top as the last vowel of Adonai, and a kametz at the bottom as the last vowel on the name. Rabbi Bachrach says that there's not one vowel that hints at Adonai. Really? Let's look at the middle vowel. Do these two vowels perhaps look similar? Do they hint at each other? They're exactly, precisely the same. They're both a cholam. They're both a or. They look the same, they are the same. This rabbi says there's not one vowel that hints at Adonai. Really? Let's look at the first two vowels. The first vowel on the name and the first vowel on Adonai. Do they hint at each other? Do they look similar? Of course they do. If you have eyes and you can see, you might be able to see at the top we have two dots and a stripe, and at the bottom we have two dots. They look similar. They hint at each other. How much more if you know from Hebrew grammar and from reading the Masoretic manuscripts that the only reason for the difference is the aleph and the yod. Then they not only hint at each other, then you know they're basically the same vowel, and the reason for the difference are the different consonants. For those of you who are used to seeing Hebrew manuscripts, here's an example from the Leningrad Codex. 2/3 of the vowels are exactly the same, and the first vowel certainly hint at the first vowel of Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh certainly hints at the first vowel of Adonai, especially if you know how these pointings work. Leviticus 19 verse 11 says, Lo tignovu v'lo tekachashu v'lo teshakkaru ish ba'emito. Ye shall not steal, neither shall ye deal falsely, nor lie one to another. This Rabbi Bachrach lied. It is a lie to say that not one of these vowels hint at Adonai. It's just a plain lie. Unless this rabbi was totally blind and he never saw one of these vowels, he told a lie. And Nehemiah Gordon uses this lie in his article, and sometimes he quotes this rabbi on his presentations. He uses this lie to make us think that he is right. And that is dealing falsely. He's dealing falsely. Remember, when you break the Torah, that is sin. For this rabbi to lie to us is sin. It's breaking the law. For Nehemiah to deal falsely, is that breaking the law? Let's sum up what we have learned today. We have seen that Yod-Heh-Waw-Heh was read as Adonai centuries before the vowel points were added to the Hebrew Bible. Already in the 1st century there was a substitute for the name. Okay, the substitute was Adonai. The vowel points capture the traditional pronunciation of the Hebrew Bible even when that contradicts the consonants. Okay, so the Masoretes are going to put the vowels of Adonai on the name for us. Alright, like we explained to you earlier, this is how Ketiv Karei works. The Hebrew vowels on the name are 100% exactly grammatically correct for Adonai. However, Nehemiah Gordon is in denial. He says, no, the Hebrew vowels on the name are clearly, provably, definitively not the vowels of Adonai. Is this ignorance or is this dishonesty? Is this ignorance or is this dishonesty? Nehemiah Gordon is not ignorant of what we discussed today. Nehemiah says, what I told you about the composite shua changing into a simple shua for this Ketiv Karei, Nehemiah says that's utter nonsense. So that's why in the next session we are going to talk about this. We are going to look at Hebrew manuscripts to answer this question. Would the scribes, the Masoretic scribes, change a composite shua into a simple shua for Ketiv Karei Perpetuum? Yes or no? Until next time, Shalom and Yeshua Mashiach.